on Kafka, Dostoevsky, Beckett, and others, and they all seem to have certain existential motivations and have been some of the forerunners of what people like to call perhaps existentialist literature or philosophy. Is there this similarity, I suppose, between existentialism as a genre or a philosophy to anti-theodicy? Is there a certain affinity between these two? Because I guess in from comparative literature, there does seem to be some almost inseparable nature of these two ideas.
Yes, I think in some ways there are at least important analogies. If we think of writers such as Camus, for example, I suppose Camus would be maybe the most obvious example of an existentialist writer whose work can also be read as anti-theodicist or anti-theodical. Again, this is something we're not explicitly dealing with in that book, but certainly something that could be further discussed. There is actually a relatively recent essay by a former PhD student of mine, Alex Rahmanin, who wrote on Camus and anti-theodicy. So there is some work available on that that topic actually. But then we also need to make distinctions between the different existentialists, and for example, already the case of Jean-Paul Sartre is interesting and also maybe different, because even though Sartre emphasizes this, like the individual being thrown into an absurd world and having to make an existential choice and so on, there is still in his work the tendency to somehow to somehow choose to follow an ideology, and in his case, of course, communism and so there is the tendency to subordinate the individual, and even to somehow make suffering justified or somehow meaningful in the context of such an ideology, and that I think is antithetical to anti-theodicy. It's a kind of a quasi-theodicy, a kind of a secular theodicy. One thing we haven't been talking about so much is this kind of extension of the theodicy issue to secular contexts, including political contexts. And I think in many cases political ideologies, for example communism, can easily take the place of a theodical scheme, a kind of ultimate scheme of meaningfulness within which individual sufferings somehow make sense. And again, the anti-theodicist line would be to problematize that and to argue for the significance of the human individual. And I think Camus does that, and in a way that Sartre doesn't. Again, I'm not an expert on those French thinkers and writers, but you're quite right that they can be quite interestingly be brought into some sort of dialogue with this theodicy, anti-theodicy discussion.
That's quite fascinating. And you do raise, I suppose, Sartre in relationship to the concept of narratives or the role that narratives might play in theodical and anti-theodical discussions. Do you think it's necessarily the case that anti-theodicy must be almost a denial of the existence of any meta-narratives or any structures in which evil and God can be placed together? Or is it possible, at least for some anti-theodicies, to be open to some narratives or some structures? Like, what's the relationship between those two? Is it a necessary objection, or is it kind of more likely that they're against each other?
Yeah, maybe the latter. I wouldn't make any absolute or definitive claims. But I think on the whole, like the general picture would be, just as you said, that anti-theodicists are critical of the way of thinking that in terms of some ultimate narrative things make sense, or some meta narrative, if you wish. There is some ultimate meaningfulness that we can that we can somehow articulate in terms of such a narrative about how God and evil are compatible with each other, or replacing God with something else, like historical meaningfulness, for example, offering a kind of a teleological narrative of history would be another case of secular theodicy. So I'm also very much interested in these ways in which we might somehow extrapolate from the core problem of evil and suffering in the philosophy of religion to wider contexts of the same kind of speculation about the meaningfulness of suffering or the justification of suffering. COVID, by the way, provides interesting examples of that kind as well, and also many other, of course, historical events and political events and issues.